Hello, and welcome back to the Forbidden Knowledge Podcast. My name is Nathaniel Hoytmacher, and I will be the show's host. Last time, we were talking about the elucidation and the Arthurian myth and tradition, and the fairy accord, or the fairy agreement, or something along those lines with it, depending upon how you want to look at it. And I've been studying more about this tradition since then, meaning specifically the Fae, or the fairies, or the fair folk, or the good people as they're called in various different traditions and whatnot. And last time I kind of uh, made it so that way they were seen as something similar to elves in my mind at that particular point. And I still hold that that is a loosely true idea at this stage of my research into things with it. Today, I thought I would go and showcase what I've been doing. I'm going to pull from a very particular story. It's a Scottish fairy tale, and I'm just going to read it. It's not very long. I think it's like 2.5, 3 pages long, something like that. And then I'm going to be going over what some of the stuff means inside of the fairy tale in order to help us understand this tradition better, because obviously they're going to keep popping up again and again, meaning the fairies, that is, or the fair folk, or the fae, or whatever, inside the Arthurian myth and tradition, because we even have where we have Arthur's sister, Morgan le Fay, Morgan the Fairy, as I mentioned before. So this is something that is going to continuously be a huge returning point inside of the stories and myths, legends, and traditions and lore. So we need to make sure that we understand how this aspect works, what they represent a bit better and whatnot. And I'm going to continue to look more into it than just what I'm presenting here, but I figured this would be a good introduction to the research and what has been going on with it and how it dovetails with other things I've already researched before and have been looking into. And so without further ado, I'm going to pull from the story now. So we're going to be pulling from a book by Donald Alexander McKenzie, which was compiled or published in 1917, which means that everything that I'm reading, if I'm reading it word for word, is now in the public domain. The book is entitled Wonder Tales from Scottish Myth and Legend. And we're going to be pulling from chapter 9. Chapter 9 is called A Vision of the Dead, and we'll see why that it's entitled that as we go further into the story here for what's going on. And so without further ado, I'm just going to begin reading. There once dwelt in Nithsdale a woman who was enabled by fairy aid to see the spirits of the dead in the otherworld. This was how it came about. One day she sat up spinning wool in her house. Her baby lay in a cradle beside her, listening to the soft humming sound of the spinning wheel and her mother's sweet song. Suddenly a rustling, like the rustling of dead leaves in the wind, was heard at the door. The woman looked up and saw a beautiful lady, clad in green and carrying a baby. She entered and smiling sweetly spoke and said, "Will you nurse my bonny baby until I return?" The woman answered, "Yes, I shall do that." She took the baby in her arms, and the lady went away, promising to return. But the day went past, and night came on, and still she did not come back for the child. The woman wondered greatly, but she wondered even more the next morning when she awoke to find beside her bed beautiful new clothes for her children, and in the new clothes, and to find that they fitted well. Excuse me, I misread there. Morning she woke to find beside her bed beautiful new clothes for her children and some delicious cakes. Being very poor, she was glad to dress her children in the new clothes and to find that they fitted well. The cakes were of wheaten bread and a honey flavor. It was a great delight to the children to eat them. The lady did not return that day, nor the next. Weeks went past, and the woman nursed the strange child. Months went past, and still the lady stayed away. On many a morning, wheaten cakes with honey flavor were found in the house. When the children's clothes were nearly worn out, new clothing was provided for them as mysteriously as before. Summer came on, and one evening the lady clad in green again entered the house. A child who was playing on the floor stretched forth her hands to grasp the shining silver spangles that adorned her gown. But to her surprise, her hands passed through them as if they were sunbeams. The woman perceived this and knew that her visitor was a fairy. Said the fairy lady, "You have been kind to my bonny baby. I will now take her away." The woman was sorry to part with the child and said, "You have a right to her, but I love her dearly." Said the fairy, "Come with me and I shall show you my home." The woman went outside with the fairy. They walked through a wood together and then began to climb a green hill on the sunny side. When they were halfway to the top, the fairy said something that the woman did not understand. No sooner had she spoken than the turf on a bank in front of them lifted up and revealed a door. This door opened and two entered through the doorway. When they did so, the turf came down and the door was shut. The woman found herself in a bare chamber which was dimly lighted. "Now you shall see my home," said the fairy woman, who took from her waistband a goblet containing a green liquid. She dropped 3 drops of this liquid in the woman's left eye and said, "Look now." The woman looked and was filled with wonder. A beautiful country stretched out in front of her. There the green hills fringed by trees, crystal streams flashing in sunlight, and a lake that shone like burnished silver. Between the hills there lay a field of ripe barley. The fairy then dropped 3 drops of the liquid green in the woman's right eye and said, "Look now." The woman looked and she saw men and women and she had known in times past, cutting the barley and gathering fruit from the trees. She cried out, "I see many who once lived on earth and have long been dead. What are they doing here?" Said the fairy, "These people are suffering punishment for their evil deeds." When she had spoken thus, the fairy woman passed her hand over the woman's eye, and the vision of the green hills and harvest fields and reapers vanished at once. She found herself standing once more in the bare, dimly lighted chamber. Then the fairy gave her gifts of cloth and healing ointments, and leading her to the door, bade her farewell. The door opened, the turf was lifted up, and the woman left the fairy's dwelling and returned to her own home. For a time she kept the power of the fairies, seeing the fairies, as they went to and fro near her house. But one day she spoke to one of them, and the fairy asked, "With which eye do you see me?" Said the woman, "I see with both my eyes." The fairy breathed on her eyes, then was lost to sight. Never again did the woman behold the fairies, for the power that had been given to her was taken away from her eyes by this fairy to whom she had spoken. Alright, so there's lots to unpack here. Lots of very interesting material if you know what you're looking for and how to understand it. So first thing, it talks about, the place where it is, Nithsdale, which is in Scotland. So clearly there's, Gaelic, ancient Celtic, whatever tradition here in which this originated from. And we're talking about a quest for the otherworld. It even mentions that the spirits of the dead in the otherworld, and this is how the entry of the story begins here. And then explains how it came about. There's the woman, the earthly woman. She sat there with the spinning of the wool in her house. This is already telling a lot because we call it the strands of fate, the threads of fate. Spinning and weaving of fate and whatnot has always been that particular way for what it is. We see this with her spinning wheel that she's doing and whatnot. We have, like the wheel of fortune, the wheel of fate, this wheel in the sky that keeps on turning. All of these similar concepts for what's going on. The millstone, a wheel that grinds everything. These are all shout outs to that particular concept that's happening there on that particular front. And, we see all of that. So that's something to keep in mind. That's already laying the foundations having to do with fate and consciousness and what happens on that particular front that was there. Suddenly, we see the rustling of dead leaves in the wind, and she heard at the door. So now we have the air element that's being drawn about here. All right? So we have that as we see this here when that part comes in. And then she sees a beautiful lady, all right, clad in green and carrying a baby. So there's a beautiful woman, and she's clad in green, the color of nature, the color of abundance, the color of anything that has to do with green and being evergreen and living forever or whatever and that kind of stuff. We see this with the Green Man as another example for what's going on in other myths and traditions, which plays out in another tradition with Sir Gawain and the beheading game. Shout out to that particular one will be there too. So, this woman then enters in, smiling sweetly, and she speaks, "Will you nurse my bonny baby until I return?" And of course, the woman answered yes, that she'll do that. This may seem like a very strange request to someone of today, but back then villages were too tiny. Things were very different from how they are. Hospitality was an absolutely huge part of things with that. We saw that being talked about even last time with the, people coming to the wells and getting the cups from them and being fed their favorite food and whatnot until the fairy accords were broken. So hospitality was absolutely a huge part of these cultures that were going on, even especially for strangers. And it was just expected to have certain things done with it and a certain level of trust for things, for what's happening. And so that part there is talking about that particular aspect of things in order for us to understand why this would just be there for what it is. It's not something that's unusual at all for this time period for when these stories originated. So she takes the child. The lady went, promising to return. All right, so we see all that. So the woman wondered greatly what was happening when she didn't come back for it. And of course, you see the next morning when she awoke to find herself, new clothes for her children and delicious cakes. This is letting us know about a couple things for what's going on here. We see that there's food that's left out. This is typically what has been done in traditions by the folk people and folklore traditions in order to make it so that way they do this to appease the spirits and to appease people with it. They leave food out for them. And in this case, it's some sort of sweet, delicious cakes that's being left for the children. Instead, it's just a reflex of this notion in the story. It's the same concept. It's just being reversed for how it's played out. As for the new clothes, this is something that plays out with other things with it, the threads of fate, the strands of fate, the creating of new clothing. This was something that was very traditional for women to do for long, long periods of time, making their own clothes and making their own stuff for what's going on for the children and that kind of stuff. So it's a play on that as well, and kind of shaping the destiny of the children by what they're wearing and the different phases of their life, which is why new ones pop up as the old ones get worn out and the children get older and that kind of thing for what's going on. It even mentions that months went past and still the lady stayed away, of course. It keeps going on about that. Then, summer comes. And one evening, the lady, clad in green again, entered the house. And it also talks about how this child is a strange child and that there is something that's very special about this, which actually gets into the notion of the wondrous child, which is something that a scholarly term that has to do with Celtic child and being that is unique of some sort, usually male, not always. In this case, it's a female child that we learn about for what's going on there. And it is talking about how this is some being that has some otherworldly powers and otherworldly understanding of things, and there's something unique about this particular individual that is not true for the vast majority of other people and other places and time periods for what's going on there. So they have that's talking about stuff too. We see about silver spangles, excuse me. That's important. So you got silver, and then you have, passing through as if they were sunbeams. So not only does this do two things, because it's the silver and gold concept, precious metals, possibly an alchemical metaphor, moving things from a lower state of being to a higher state of being. The notion of alchemical wedding between the sun and the moon, the silver representing the moon, and the gold representing the sun, which is also why it's called sunbeams. But there's also another shout out here, another reference to the shining ones, as they're known in many traditions for what's going on, and that they're luminous beings that are being here in this. That's what is being spoken of. So then the fairy lady comes, takes the child away back to her realm where the child belongs. Usually, by the way, also these wondrous childs are part fae, part otherworldly being to begin with, a mixture of human and something of the otherworld and whatnot. Since we're talking about fairies in this particular instance, obviously it's of the fae for what's going on here. So then we see that the woman is going to be given something in return for helping with the child and doing things with that for a long time. They walk through a wood, and then they climb a hill. They're on the sunny side of the hill, so the illuminated part rather than the non-illuminated part, which is the play between light and darkness here, is another notion for what's going on. It's also the mentioning of, she didn't return by nightfall, and then passing of the day, back and forth. It's also a play on that. Then they went halfway to the top. The fairy woman says something that she did not understand. So clearly she hasn't been initiated into higher levels of understanding that the fairy woman is about to show her. No sooner had she spoken than the turf on the bank in front of them lifted up and revealed a door. So a portal, a pathway to the other world. The world where the dead reside. The world where the fairy folk reside. So they open through it. And then they shut the door. Now they're in complete darkness. This is an important part for what's going on. If you shut the turf door, clearly there's nothing inside for what's going on. You're now completely encased in the earth, which gives us Mother Earth a concept, and being there from womb to tomb for everything that it provides for us. We'll play and go into that concept a lot more later on, but just know that that's what's being talked about here as well in terms of certain aspects. That this is a initiation into the occult mysteries that are happening here, and this is the remnants of it passed down in folklore. She even mentioned that it was dimly lighted. Then the fairy woman says, "Now you shall see my home." And she took from her from her waistband, a goblet containing a green liquid. So we see goblet again. It's the same thing with the chalice from the tradition that we're talking about with the Arthurian myth and legend, which is partly why I chose this, because clearly there's something here and more to it. And the green liquid has its own meaning, which I'm not entirely certain of yet. I've heard from other traditions more of the red gold idea, which I'm more familiar with. So I'll have to look into what that deeper meaning is, why the color green there. It could just represent the same notion as before of the evergreen tree and whatnot, and making it so that way that it holds like eternal life on that particular front, with it just like the pine trees and evergreen trees never lose their leaves during winter time. Could be something like that. Could be, I don't know for certain though. So, of course, the woman in the story, she's now filled with wonder, and she sees a beautiful country stretched out in front of her. So she's, um, I'm sorry, I skipped something that's important. The fairy, she goes and drops 3 drops into her eye, specifically her left eye, and makes it so that way she can see. By doing so, she can now see another world in front of her. So she has now gained the second sight, as it is called in many traditions, allowing you to see other planes of existence that didn't exist before, that you were unaware of. In another book and another tradition for what's going on, you have what happens with Taliesin, and you have where he is helping out this goddess, and he's in front of a cauldron, and he's supposed to be help stirring it, and then eventually that particular cauldron has where it's boiling up out of things with it, and it makes it so that way from there you get where 3 drops land on his thumb, and he goes and sucks on his thumb just like that, and makes it so that way afterwards that's when he gains illumination, and he gains all this insight into the world and things that he was never supposed to know. And originally it wasn't for him, at least according to the tradition, it was supposed to be for somebody else. And then there's a whole nother part that goes on to the story for what's going on. Now the reason why I'm bringing this up is because this is a direct shout out to that particular tradition. There's also another one that has to do a slightly different way that it's been formulated, but it's still pretty much the same concept. So this is an Indo-European concept for sure, at a minimum, and obviously there are other traditions that have this goblet/chalice-like thing. It's in the Sumerian tradition, and it's also in the ancient Egyptian tradition, neither of which are Indo-European. So it's something that's more than just the Indo-European, but obviously it's a huge Indo-European influence. And what we see is that there are 3 wells. And inside of these wells that are done in the Nordic tradition, you need to drink from each one of them, and each one gives you a certain level of illumination and whatnot. And that makes it so that way Odin eventually gets to see things with it. And one of the wells, he has to cast his eye into it in order to get it from Mimir's Brunner, that's what it's called, the well of Mimir, the well of memory, which gets us to the next part for what's happening of this particular story as well, and another understanding of it, which is that there's memory. You have to be able to remember these particular events that you're seeing on the other side for what's happening here. And of course, we learn later on in the story that this is taken away. So in the traditions, and this is true of the Greek traditions as well, was like the Orphic mystery traditions also bring up this concept of having multiple wells or multiple cauldrons or multiple ways of drinking things with it. And so it shows the duplicitous nature that goes down the side with it, with one leading to life, the other one leading to death. And that makes it so that way, or to a loss of memory and not remembering anything and just going back to the regular world without it. So you have one fairy, one side of it that shows the goodness of their hearts and whatnot because of what was done. You made it so that way they could go and see again. She got to see the realm. She got to see the realm of the dead. She got to see where the fairy live and all this other stuff for what's going on. She's even told that some of them are there because of the misdeeds that they did, the bad deeds in their life. You have eventually, though, where the fairy kind of encounters another fairy that's a negative fairy, one that doesn't want her to see these things, and it's taken away, and she loses the sight. So it's showing that in these initiation rites, in these aspects that are going on there, that there's always the chance that you can lose it and never fully recover from it and not remember everything that was that way in the stories. You see this with Otter and the Nordic traditions as well, to make it so that way he can drink from kind of a hag-like person that's on the other side with it. And then there's also Freya, the goddess Freya, who's bringing that to her. So you have a giantess that's called Hyndla, and you have that on the other side with the goddess Freya. And so he can choose to remember everything that was taught to him on that side of things and make it so that way he can bring back that knowledge to this physical plane of existence, or he can lose it all and either not remember anything at all, or in some cases even lead to death and desolation and destruction. I think what this is also playing at is that you can literally make it so way by doing some of these initiation rites, people can be killed if they go through them and they're not properly prepared. They can die doing with. You also have to where you can go insane doing some of these things. Or for those who go through it properly, they literally have knowledge of another world, of another plane of existence. And so that's what's being talked about here with this particular story that is going on here and the deeper meanings behind it. Just want to make sure there's nothing else that I'm missing that's of any importance whatsoever. There's gifts that are given to her and healing ointments. Yeah. So the gifts have to do again with what they would. It's a reflex. It's a gifts of giving it to the people that were in the burial mounds that they would go and do stuff with. This also probably has to do with ancestor worship of some sort, going in there and bringing them with it. We know that in the Nordic tradition, as an example, the Elvish people. There are some of them that are in a realm that's not touched by death and that kind of thing. And so, that's going to be playing into that as well. Hence why I'm relating the elves to the fairies. I'm not saying they're exactly the same. They very well could be. I need to study this more. But this is where things are on that particular front. And so I'm trying to show you that on this side of things, there's also why the fair folk, as they're called, or the good people, as they're called in certain other traditions and whatnot, are, not necessarily always seen as good. Some of that is Christian influence in the sense that anything that's pagan is not good and therefore you shouldn't follow it. Some of it also has to do with the fact that whenever you're dealing with forces on other levels of existence, other planes of existence, you never know what you're going to get. You can get one that's going to be beneficial. You can get one that's going to be maleficent and whatnot. So you have to make sure that you're prepared to deal with either case for it. And that's what it's showing here, is the dichotomy between the two sides, that there is both good and evil, chaos and destruction, with creation and light. And this is clearly a shout out, a story, a folk memory that has to do with a much more ancient tradition, and this is the remnants of it that have survived to the time period of 1917 when this was first written down. And of course, this is still, once it was written down, it became stagnant and not part of, folklore in the sense of being passed down through oral tradition. And so it hasn't changed much in 100 years. And there's still lots of this that's there that can be seen. So I hope this was fascinating and that it brought new light onto the fairy side of things, and the accords that can go on with it. We'll touch more on this other stuff. We're just trying to understand how some of this works with the fairy people a bit more. And I feel that this particular story really illustrates a good amount of what this is all about. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and subscribe. And more importantly, make it so that way you share this and pass it on to somebody else who you think would be really find this fascinating or enjoy. Thank you very much. Take care.